Thanks everyone for joining today. It is my pleasure to welcome today Ahmet Akkoç from SiteLab, who will present about time series prediction in patients with rheumatoid arthritis. And I do disagree with the rest of the presentation title. Of course, the world is ready for time series forecasting, and especially when it's by you, Ahmet. Over to you. Looking very much forward to your presentation.
All right. Thank you so much for having me, Franz. To everyone attending, I would like to save the questions for the end, but you see here that there's a link that I've also shared on Teams. If you have any questions during the presentation, please click this link to submit it, and then I'll try and cover them in the last few minutes. This is an example question. So if you submit it like that, it gets added to my list, and then I can get back to you when I'm done presenting. So without further ado, I'll just quickly maybe talk about myself and my company. So SiteLab, we're a consultancy based in Denmark. We use methods, technologies, and organizational science to empower healthcare. My manager's background is in economics, so I think there's a lot of organizational science involved besides, well, more than what you'd expect from a company like us. But the short answer is we do private research. Working together with university hospitals in Denmark, various other international partners, but at least in the scope of this project, I think it's more or less Danish researchers who were involved. Right, so quick overview. Let's talk about time series forecasting in healthcare. I know we've had some past talks on this, just briefly following Discord, but generally time series and healthcare don't mix so well. We talk about economics and maybe some other domains, not so much healthcare. So let's talk about why. And then I will focus specifically on temporal fusion transformers. You might be familiar with those if you've played with pytorch-forecasting before, and how we were able to create a forecasting model that would predict if patients will recover or get worse based on some 40,000 patient visits. And then the reason why I'm a bit pessimistic in my presentation is there were a lot of pitfalls throughout the project that aren't so much related to PyTorch forecasting, that aren't so much related to science, but it's worth talking about them because I think it's like we're in an important point where people are just starting to accept AI as a fact of life, but only some kinds of AI. So I still think that forecasting models face a lot of kind of opposition. So that will be like a good chunk of the talk. And finally, why the world isn't yet ready, which will kind of be my take on, what can we do for time series to make sense to more people? Right. So let's begin with kind of the problem. The research I was focused on the last year is specifically with a disease called rheumatoid arthritis. I apologize if the images are a bit too graphic. RA, or rheumatoid arthritis, is a chronic autoimmune condition. In plain English, that means you have a long-term disease, and it's sort of triggered by your immune system that protects you against diseases attacking itself, hence autoimmune. It primarily affects the joints, leading to pain and inflammation. And what's very important, I think, is it's a chronic disease that we can think of as a time series of some kind. When the disease first starts, it's practically invisible since it's only kind of your internal physiologic systems that have some kind of change. But over time, as the patient continues encountering the changes in their body over the course of several years, your joints become increasingly more swollen until at some point it's very visible and it starts to impact your mobility as a patient. And so, yes, it's both a time series in how the disease activity increases over time, and it's also a time series in the sense that when you administer treatment for a chronic disease, it's not the same as an acute treatment. So if you're feeling sick, you can take painkillers and then hopefully you'll get better soon. Whereas with a chronic autoimmune condition, you need to continue taking very long therapy over the course of several months just as your body attacks itself, you need to kind of counteract it. And that's not something that can happen acutely. It's more like a process, hence modeling it as a time series or survival curve makes it a lot better to understand what's going on. What's the current goal in treating RA? Well, there are several therapies, but some of them work for some people, some of them don't. So it's less about trying to understand how to treat the problem so much as optimizing the treatments that are available. Not always obvious that it's a time series. So this is kind of my way of trying to explain to people that you can think of this disease as a time series. So we have something called the disease activity score, which is based on some objective and subjective values. And what you see on the left is kind of this DAS score for an initial group. And over time, on the right, you see how it progresses. What you can think about is it's as if when you are a patient, you start somewhere on this initial distribution of a DAS score, and depending on how responsive you are to the treatment, you can get better, which means your activity score, disease activity, drops towards 0, or you can get worse, where it kind of goes up and becomes elevated. So it does form something that looks like a multi-Gaussian when we kind of try to plot the different patients, their disease activity scores, and kind of what they were observed during visits. So I hope slow by slow, I'm convincing people that this is in fact a time series, even though you wouldn't immediately think that it is at first glance. And then another measure we use in addition to DAS28 is the much more simplified swollen joint count. So for the sake of simplicity, I'll get back to that. We don't work on the full disease activity score. We deal with something called swollen joint count, which, roughly speaking, a doctor will observe kind of 28 key points on your body and will determine how many of them are swollen, right? So the more progressive the disease is, you expect the number to approach 28, and the better a patient is doing, you expect it to go towards 0. So 28 means high disease activity, 0 means low. We want to go from high to low. I hope that all makes sense so far. So what exactly is the challenge here? We have 2 asterisks. I'll get to those. We have a kind of primary therapy called methotrexate that serves as a starting point and has about a 40% success rate. So the star number 1 is, this is for Denmark and Scandinavia. I know that the UK and US seem to have kind of different strategies when it comes to the disease. But the reality we face in Denmark is, also if you look at the image below, it's more or less cut in stone what people encounter. So if you are given a diagnosis for this disease, you will immediately be given methotrexate as a therapy because it's cost effective, it has minimal side effects, it's actually used for several treatments. You might also have encountered it as kind of a therapy people might be taking together with chemotherapy and cancer. So it's very widely available, and it's generally believed that it kind of minimizes side effects. Other countries, they think differently, but the reality we face in Denmark is specifically, everyone is systematically recommended the same treatment, which is more likely to fail than succeed. That's the part they don't tell you. But it's just kind of, because there's so much variability between people and how they respond to therapies, we take a very conservative strategy of, let's put them on methotrexate first and then see what else they can switch to. On the right, you kind of see an illustration of the different ways this strategy might go. If it is effective, like it is in about 40% of the cases, that's kind of a, I'll say, rule of thumb, because different studies have challenged kind of the 40% rate. That's just the way I've been presented it and the way I'm presenting it to you. The first possibility is that methotrexate does work and the patient's swollen joints start to heal. Then we just assume methotrexate is working and the patient is kept on it. Outcome number 2, maybe methotrexate is helping but not enough, so the patient might be prescribed a second or third therapy to take it in combination. And then finally, perhaps the patient is allergic to methotrexate, because that's also a possibility. They might discontinue the treatment altogether. And then in some cases, 6 months is something like an important checkpoint. In some cases, therapy can be less than 180 days. Maybe you had a misdiagnosis, maybe the patient passes away. So this is kind of the reality we exist in right now with the current kind of treatment recommendations without involving AI in Denmark and wider Scandinavia, even if not the entire Europe. So I'll avoid overgeneralizing too much. And then traditionally, yeah, because we do have kind of these important points like month 6, month 3, it's the same patient story for every patient who's given the diagnosis that they start on this therapy. And then over time, they'll have follow-ups which determine if there should be a minor or major decision taken in how to treat them. So what we're interested in is, can we kind of predict, is methotrexate going to help someone? Is methotrexate not going to help them, so as to make the decision process a bit faster? And what we're working with is some 11,000 patients who have 42,621 visits in all. I'm not sure if I can bring out a pen. I think there should be one here. There we go. Yes, laser. What do I mean by this? Just as I've tried to explain, that it's kind of a time series data set that we're working on. That underlying data set has kind of 11,170 unique patients, and then 42,621 data points, where a visit point is essentially a patient, their values, and how many days they've been on treatment as kind of the time variable. You can also think of patients as a group. I think that's the way the SK-Time API refers to it. So if we have 2 or 3 visits that are linked by a patient, they kind of exist in the same group, if that makes sense. And then what clinical measurements do we include? We include kind of some blood tests. We include their age, and I believe biological sex, so as to put a profile on the patients. There are some common variables that are shared, but in addition to that, we want to be able to use what you get from the intermediate visits to make a more precise or adjusted prediction, instead of see the patient once and make a prediction 1 year in the future. And what was relevant to us was kind of temporal fusion transformers, which you might have heard of if you've worked with the pytorch-forecasting library. I know there's been a lot of changes to the API, so Franz is probably much more up to date than I am. When I was working on it about 1 year ago, it was just slightly different, but pytorch-forecasting is kind of a sister project at SK-Time, at least to my knowledge. So some of the functions are shared between them, but I kind of discovered pytorch-forecasting first, so I'll be giving my examples from there if anything seems a bit outdated. Very basically, temporal fusion transformers combine what can be described as time series information or targets together with some initial static covariates. So when I mention kind of biological sex or starting age, that's kind of static information. If you started treatment at age 56, 2 years later, you'll still have started the treatment at age 56. Whereas a target would be, if we follow your disease activity score or swollen joint count over time, that's something that varies, right? And so as we gather new visits, we would like to adjust our prediction based on new information, instead of just doing a one-shot prediction of what's going to come next. So yeah, basically it handles kind of static and dynamic components. I'm not sure how easy it is to read, but you can also see kind of my pre-processing and model construction code down below. So that's it. I mean, we took patients we could find in the Danish hospitals, their visit data, and then asked the question, can we try and predict kind of how will a patient's swollen joint count or tender joint count change over time. Let's see. So I think it was something like a 90-10 training test separation. Ignore the 80-20. That must be from an earlier image. And you might be wondering, okay, how do we take these visits and convert them into a time series? I try using this illustration to kind of explain what's going on. So let's suppose we have a patient who has 4 visits from kind of start of treatment to the first 6 months. So then V1 would be something like day 0, V2 would be day 28, day 150. And then what we tried to aim for was kind of points that are close to month 6. That would be the visit that was closest to day 180 before or equal to day 180. So that's visit 4 in this case. It could be the 2nd or 5th visit, depending on how frequent this patient had to make visits. And then what we tried to optimize was computing the error between sort of this last point based on however many points you had to get there. And then we generated some prediction P that your swollen joint count was expected to be something like 12, but then if it turns out that the historically recorded one was 0 or 18, we compute a loss function based on those 2 visits, kind of your predicted score and your actual visit score, to try and optimize our model. Very abstract. I apologize for this. It also took us maybe like 6 months to figure out what would be a meaningful loss function, but at least in terms of proof of concept, I think this made the most sense. There's also probably people in the audience thinking, can't you work with alternative cutoffs? Yes, for sure. But I guess kind of first 180 days was the interesting thing for our partners. So it ended up being take the first n visits in the first 180 days. The last visit should be what you're trying to predict, and n-1 data points will kind of form your time series to predict on. Scale of training, I think we had some 100,000 parameters, and it takes about 40 minutes to train. Results, very briefly, you can scan this QR code if you want to learn more. We try to evaluate the prediction model on a simulated mid-treatment scenario, where that means you take kind of the historical data, as I mentioned, and then try to predict what comes towards the end. So what you see here in figure 1a, this would be what our model predicts if a new patient starts treatment. You give kind of their demographic information, and then ask the question, will this patient be able to achieve 0 or 1 swollen joint count, 0 or 1 swollen joints in the next 180 days? And then, yeah, the way TFTs work is they compute a kind of quantile loss. So you can also get a little boundary of kind of expected worst and best performance. And then in 1b, you see what happens if we update this prediction based on a second visit, where contrary to how we expected, the patient didn't respond as optimistically to the treatment. So now the curve is kind of a bit more narrow. It's a bit more straight because we expect there to be kind of a point where it converges to a certain expectation. And indeed, while the first prediction suggested kind of 5 months to reach 0 swollen joints, it turns out to be that the second prediction with this visit says that you should expect to reach 0 swollen joints after 6 months of treatment for this particular patient. That's the general gist of what we're trying to do. And then for performance evaluation, we were asked, root mean square error and similar metrics are a bit difficult to understand. Can you try splitting it into a kind of classification system? So what is considered kind of a recovery scenario is if you have 1 or 0 swollen joints, as opposed to having more. So we created kind of a binary outcome from this time series. And there, when it comes to overall accuracy, gets about 68% on the training set and 74 in validation, which probably has a lot of the audience curious. And then notably, we are much better at predicting patients who will recover, who will reach kind of 1-0 swollen joints, as opposed to those that seem to resist methotrexate, where we have a problem of low specificity. So that's all fair and good. Let's talk about kind of the things that went wrong that were a bit surprising. So the first problem was data missingness. Medical records are rarely complete. It could be that someone made a visit, but the doctor didn't have time to take a blood test, or they took a blood test, forgot to enter results. And so kind of the different variables we use, you can see here: swollen joint count, tender joint count, CRP, age, sex. But there's also other variables that might be relevant, such as socioeconomic status, BMI, etc. Unfortunately, we didn't have kind of good coverage on these variables, so we chose a very minimal data set that wouldn't require so much pre-processing. What would be a better solution, and what I personally advocated for, although the collaborators kind of objected, is if you're familiar with masking techniques, it's possible to kind of optimize a model even if you have lots of kind of missing data points within the set. So that's something worth exploring. It was a bit difficult for me to kind of communicate to the other researchers that in machine learning, we have a technique of masking where you can sort of hide data points. The confusion arose when I said we have 11,000 patients, but many of them asked, if you have 11,000 patients, why do only 500 of them have BMI? If you come from a statistical background, that sounds like you're making up data. But if you come from a machine learning or especially computer vision background, it's not uncommon that you have kind of a lot of samples, but those samples have different coverages when it comes to what features are available. So that's problem number one. Data missingness both makes it much harder to train a good model, and it also makes it difficult to convince people that you need to approach data missingness instead of just saying, this is all we have, at the risk of creating selection biases. Gotcha number two, a lot of people were kind of curious, asking, what is your overall finding? Recall earlier how I mentioned that currently the way that people in Denmark think is methotrexate succeeds 40% of the time. Why should we change the way we do things? A lot of research tends to be presented in the form of generalizations. If you do X, it leads to Y. There's some kind of thing where you have agency, where you can cause something better to happen. And so when we tried to present this as a medical conference saying we've developed this kind of prediction model, for one thing, not everyone is familiar with prediction models. And for a second thing, they were especially not familiar with time series forecasting. So we had a few people come up to us, I think those who've worked with LLMs or maybe computer vision, that were fairly able to understand what was going on. But if you are not so much literate with, let's say, modern AI, time series forecasting just feels too far-fetched for people to be able to relate to what was going on. So that was an actual problem. When I tried to explain to people what was going on, what were the results, the response was, well, your predictors and your outcomes seem to align with what is already known, and people weren't so much interested in how you can get kind of a time series that illustrates the patient is getting better or worse, because it's a very personal thing and it's not kind of an overall generalization, if that makes sense. And finally, gotcha number three, is this a coin flip? It can be very tricky to interpret the results when you as a researcher have to kind of look at a poster and aren't allowed to play with the model we created. So even with confidence intervals, we cannot guarantee 100% prediction of the future. So it begs the question, why not flip a coin instead of running a prediction model? The way people conceive randomness can be very different, but obviously it's a different thing if you succeed 2 out of 3 times as opposed to a coin which would be a 50-50. So I've tried to explain to people how uncertainty is not the same thing as unknowability, but that's still at least a foreign concept from what I've encountered. And then the people who saw our model were more interested in kind of this final prediction, right? Not so much the timeline. From my point of view, at least, I was very interested in if we can kind of create these intervals of this is kind of your best expected performance, this is your worst expected performance. It might give people ideas of should we switch therapies early? Should we consider alternatives? Should we consider kind of supplemental therapies? But the general context where we talk about prediction, at least in medicine and healthcare, is it's always about some starting point, some ending point, and it's very much isolated from the decision process. It's very much isolated from the treatment itself. If I have a key message here, I think we can indeed build kind of impressive time series forecasting models to forecast patient outcomes, just like you can forecast the weather, you can forecast economic trends. But the reality is, whereas most domains are content with seeing, oh, it's very accurate, it performs well, and then adopting, for healthcare, there seems to be a very general need for a paradigm shift in how people think about healthcare and how we engage with technology. The implementation of time series forecasting faces, I would say, more human barriers than technological ones at this time. So this is something Franz and I know, and probably not the rest of the speakers, but this project originally concluded in January of 2025, and I was just asked not to publish anything before the conferences were approved for, and that's why I'm presenting now in July. But during that time, I think there was a lot of defeatism within my team who kind of thought maybe TFTs didn't help so much. We don't have any reason to explore time series forecasting. We should stick with more conventional methods. In the middle of that, I was talking to one of my colleagues, Alexander, as you can see over here, and he was interested in working on a sort of manufacturing project where there was a very obvious need for time series forecasting of when will machines kind of make errors, how you can treat those errors, and so on. So I more or less communicated to him everything we did on the project, as well as all of the human factors that led to its failure. And he ended up getting at least much better success out of that. So he's published his thesis from the Technical University of Denmark. And I hope to see that his project probably goes better places than ours has gone. And again, it showed me understanding the system is a lot more crucial to kind of breaking the habits needed to work with time series forecasting. It's not maybe so much about having perfect data, so much as everyone being on board. This is why we need to think about the problem as a time series instead of a binary or instead of a random variable, arbitrary random variable, because only then can people actually take the necessary dialogue of this is what the model is doing right or wrong. That should be something we try to improve. Join or die, basically. So thank you so much. If you'd like to stay in touch, you can find my contact info here. You can scan the QR code for our company's website, or you can also reach me personally from my link tree, and I'm happy to take questions. Okay, looks like we already have quite a few. Damir asks, where do you get the data points? Is it collected solely through hospitals or some international database where multiple hospitals share their data? On the very first slide, I kind of had all the participating centers, right? So we have Aalborg University, Aarhus University, and then Copenhagen University. The only reason you see CopeCare is Copenhagen University is such a big brand that they specifically wanted the CopeCare departments on there. Any interesting notes about Denmark? Denmark is unique for being a country of only public universities. So every university in Denmark is public. That means we're working with public data, but provisional access to public data. If you are kind of a researcher if you're a Danish public researcher, you'll have access to whatever data is available in your university or whatever data you have access to through data sharing agreements. That was a good thing for us because we're kind of a company that has the necessary connections to make that happen. But I had a lot of people ask me, are you thinking of kind of publishing your data sets? And the sad answer is no. I'm sadly not allowed to do that, although I think it would be a great thing in terms of reproducibility. Next question. What does cleaning that data look like? It being a healthcare professional, gather the data, is it extremely clean and precise? We can maybe talk about this later if you continue to Discord with me. The short answer is there's various kind of data entry systems. So it's like a clinician will boot up a spreadsheet to kind of note what measures they've taken from the patient. But there's a lot of ways where things can go right, and there's a lot of ways things can go wrong. Sometimes, for example, we had trouble with the prescriptions, right? Suppose I visit my doctor and my doctor prescribes me medication, but it's a busy work week. It might be 1 month later that I go to the pharmacy to actually get that treatment, or there's holidays. We're in the middle of summer holiday right now where a lot of places are closed. So the clinicians will try and enter data in the most honest way possible, but there is a lot of, shall we say, kind of systematic reasons things might be wrong. And then people have their own beliefs. So the different hospitals in Denmark will pursue kind of independent strategies. I know one of them, our partners in Aalborg remarked that they don't receive patients so frequently. Often it's small tasks are delegated to nurses who might then only record whatever few things they had to do for a routine check. And if blood tests are relevant, those blood tests are taken. If a blood test is considered irrelevant, that blood test is not taken. And then because this is a spreadsheet, right? When you try and take that data into a PyTorch data set, you're going to get maybe, we had like 4 variables that cover different blood tests, but many of them are positive, negative, or unknown because a blood test was never taken. And so you need to think about, how do I encode this information that the blood test was irrelevant or not? Masking is probably the best way to do it when you do have this many unknown variables. But at least in my case, I didn't have enough time to kind of change the optimization function to do masking in the way that I would have liked. So it ended up being that we took a minimal set of variables, a minimal set of patients, such as to minimize NA entries, and then we did some imputation, but that brings selection bias, and it's not good practice. So it means you're capturing patients who, for some reason, don't have NA values. It could be because if a patient is in a more critical situation, they will have better data coverage. So it might be that my training sample represents extreme cases rather than more, let's say, early stages of the disease. And then that also is something that hurts predictability on the validation set. Okay. Anurag asks, what future work is planned based on these results? I think I kind of explained it in the problem section. But the way I see it, at least the rheumatoid arthritis researchers I was working with expressed that they are not sure where the project would go. But our company is now trying it in, I guess, different domains, if that makes sense. So that was kind of Alexander's work that he worked together. He collaborated with Novo Nordisk. That's one of the big companies here in Denmark. And they didn't want to use it for healthcare. They actually wanted to use it for like the drug manufacturing process itself, because that's kind of a more natural time series, at least in the way people conceive of it. So yeah, it is kind of funny that we took some ideas from here, but use it in a completely different domain. But that's how life is sometimes. Jigyasu asks, so the biggest challenge you had was making the stakeholders understand the results. Without a doubt, not just the stakeholders, but also like my own team, I think I also struggled with people I was working with directly, or regardless of if they were from the hospitals, regardless if they were in the clinic, regardless if they were kind of a machine learning or statistics researcher. I would say, yeah, it's not immediately obvious why time series forecasting was relevant. And it was kind of a progression. So I think at first we tried to work with only 2 time points. So can you use kind of day 0 of treatment and month 3 to predict month 6? But at some point I had the epiphany that time series forecasting has matured to the point of why don't we try something like TFTs, where we can work with visits in between those time points instead of kind of very situational data. So it's kind of like what Dahmer was asking earlier. Like, we're working with a minimal set, but it's just a bit more expanded than what we had before. Did someone want to speak?
Yeah, so basically I was saying, I was going to ask, what was your rationale behind using TFT, and like, did you try other models or did you try a normal binary classifier?
Okay, then thank you for asking. I think it was an escalation. So we started with binary regressors, I think August 2024, maybe even before then. And then we had the idea of, can we combine month 0 and month 3? So you have 2 data points to predict the third one. That was a neural network, I guess I engineered myself. And then at some point, I kind of had the idea of maybe I should explore what other people have done instead of working with my own model. That's what led me to TFTs, and that's the primary way that became a part of the project.
Okay, got it. Thanks.
Thank you too. And then lastly, we have an anonymous question. Any open data set available? Yeah, like I told Dahmer, it's public data in Denmark. So if you are a researcher in Denmark, I can see to it becoming accessible to you, but otherwise I don't think it would really be easy for me to share it, regrettably. Second question, and the less accuracy when medication resistance is due to data imbalance. I think in part it's due to data imbalance. It's because we didn't use masking, so we definitely did select a certain type of patient. I also think it's to another extent also a problem with feature selection. So in kind of my intermediate experiments, I did try to see if you do take kind of the features of the patients and then try to use a projection technique like PCA, right? Can we try to start an unsupervised setting and see if we can determine any patterns? At least from what I observed, the feature set we worked with didn't so easily cluster. So I actually think that we're missing some key variables that would predict whether patients will recover or not, is what I would say. So I don't think it was purely due to data imbalance. There is actually a lot of uncertainty, and you prescribe patients something, maybe they have a divorce, maybe they have an accident, and they don't take the therapy as much as you would expect them to, or there's someone who cares for the patient. So what I guess I'm trying to say is there seems to be a lot of intermediate information that also changes how likely your treatment is to succeed. So if the project continues, because like I said, it's kind of in a gray area right now, I personally think the solution is to use masking so we can work with the variables that have kind of been excluded from the visits, and then see, okay, if you have kind of multiple time series, like a time series of your blood measures, time series of, let's say, weight, time series of I think we also have some things like side effects. So if a patient gets a side effect, they'll be scared and maybe avoid therapy. That tells us something. Personally, I think the main issue is we need to move towards this kind of a time series thinking instead of static cause and effect models. But yeah, data imbalance did play a part, but I just don't think it was the main reason personally. Right? Do we have any other questions if people want to ask instead of right?
We have probably time for one more, if there are any. Okay, then thank you very much, everyone, and hope to see you again next time at the SK Time meetup every Friday, 13 UTC on our Discord with research talks and open community sessions. We will now move to the Discord for a more open session if there are any other discussion points. Thanks very much, Ahmet, for a very
Thanks.
interesting talk.
Thank you all.